dress up fancy, but I'm not a fancy guy. I'm an engineer, and I've dug in dirt, and I've worked overseas on construction farms. So I've been around, and I feel right at home here. Thanks for having me. So, hey Lee.
Yes, sir.
So how are we gonna run this?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay.
See, I'm gonna get a half a dozen things, right?
Well, you're a multitasker.
One half. Yeah.
Or you're hungry. I can click right here.
Yes. All right. Yeah.
Okay. So
It was working. All right, well, I'll sit over there and advance the slides if you're ready. How about that? But you can visualize it.
okay. Yeah, I don't need to introduce myself. I'm a civil structural engineer who I've never worked on a railroad, a different kind of engineer, but I grew up loving bridges and rivers and history. And I grew up in Nashville, and my first wife died, and I have roots in Franklin. So I moved to Franklin 7 years ago, and when I got there, I started looking around and said, okay, I visited family there all the time, but now I was living there, and I said, what's really going on in Franklin? And one of the first things that came to me was that they didn't have a passenger depot. They had a freight depot built after the war. The marker out there says it's antebellum, but it's not. Keep learning about history all the time. But there have been like 4 different passenger depots in Franklin down through the years. The last one was L&N, built in 1901, torn down in about 1959. And I thought, a lot of really cool towns have a passenger depot that's used for something. Franklin doesn't, and it'd be good to have that. So I started researching the depot, and then a couple of people told me, Walter, you're retired. Why don't you just research more than just a depot? And it inspired me. You can't just decide you're going to write a book without having it as a fire. So I spent 3,500 hours over 4 years researching and writing this book and getting it published by somebody else. And what turned me on was the fact that, first of all, nobody had ever written a book about this railroad. So I'm really passionate, and I'm grateful to be the first one to do this. I wrote this book before somebody else researched it. You know, a lot of folks have written about the retreat and the other things, and the L&N Railroad, maybe Memphis and Charleston, but I was lucky to be the one to write this book. And it really excited me that the story of the railroad generally isn't told too much. You read books, you see movies, and it's all about the troops and the battlefields and the old houses and that sort of thing. And Franklin's that way. Franklin's all about the battlefields in general and the houses. And the railroad is kind of forgotten about. But I call it our railroad. Yours and mine. It's our railroad. It runs north to south, and it's got a story to tell. The vast majority of that track is right where it was in 1860, 64, 65. It's there. And it's got a story to tell that hadn't been told. You ready for me? Okay. So that's the depot. I'm not going to wear you out with this because it's not your depot. It's a Franklin thing. But that's a 1901 L&N depot that we'd like to build. And David Breland from Decatur has offered to give you some advice on that. So I'm very grateful for that. And the more I talk, the more things come to me, because at the Franklin Williamson County Library on last Thursday, a week ago, first guy that came in the room was a real engineer. Robert, he was a real engineer. He rode trains. He worked for the L&N, and he retired because he had an accident. He was on a train, driving that train in downtown Nashville, and the train ran away from him. I don't know what happened, but he couldn't control it. And he jumped off at 32 miles an hour, which isn't going to be a pretty thing. And that made him retire. I guess he wasn't physically able. But he said, Walter, if y'all build that depot, I think I can get you a caboose. Because he has connections, and there are probably a lot of cabooses lying around somewhere. So that would be really a cool thing. This is the Cowan, Tennessee depot. Okay. What do you know about Cowan?
It's a ways to get there.
Yeah.
It's right near
It's
Swan.
on the way to Swanee.
It is.
Tunnels.
Goes up the plateau, that's high.
Oh, boy. Yeah. And they have pushers. I guess they used to have pushers to get those trains up. But I took a picture of this just to show people in Franklin how cool that depot could be at Christmas and have a train lit up. So, okay, now finally to the railroad. Thank you. I call it the Nashville Decatur, but that's just for convenience. Really, there were 3 railroads between Nashville and Decatur. And it was built after the Nashville Chattanooga was built to Stevenson, and after the Memphis and Charleston was built through Decatur over to Stevenson. So we're going to talk a little bit later on about this loop. Loop was kind of important. This was the last piece of the loop to be built. And there are 3 railroads. Nashville to Columbia was the Tennessee and Alabama. That leg also went down to Mount Pleasant. And then Columbia to the state line was the Central Southern, and that state line to Decatur Junction, an important distinction, is Tennessee and Alabama Central. And I got a little note there for me, the tunnel at Decatur Junction, because that tunnel is about the coolest thing I've ever seen. Y'all know about that, I guess.
Is that called it's called another name, isn't
It's
it?
in Marjorie's Ridge, and it's a contraband camp.
Dr. Lester, was it called Lester Station?
Not right there.
Okay.
Prospect Station was probably the closest one there, because Prospect is just south of the tunnel.
There is this side of
Yeah.
is left, I'm not sure if it was full community, but there was 2, and they have been people out as part of the contraband camp or after the war, I'm not sure. It's on Paul's land.
Yeah.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
He's got well, actually the map came from, David Meagher, I believe you know him.
I do. He contributed a lot. His planning, what he thought the concept was for both sides of that tunnel.
Yeah.
He's in the book.
Yeah.
And I invited him, I told him I'd be here tonight, and I haven't heard from him. I'll be in Pulaski on Sunday, and Hall's gonna be at that meeting apparently. I haven't heard from him.
Is it gonna be in the, up there?
No, it's gonna be at the library downtown.
They're just about out of business up there, last year.
Sorry.
That's why I was wondering, the last time I spoke to them, they were on the camp commander and the adjutant were on the 2 going up meeting, and they just looked at each other for a half hour.
I don't think I wanna go to that one. Thanks for the warning. All right, so, thank you for that. So I mentioned, yes sir, thanks. I mentioned Decatur Junction. A lot of y'all know all this stuff, okay? But it was really exciting for me to learn it 6, 7 years ago. There's the Tennessee River, which was running wild at that time. That's Decatur, and Nashville and Decatur came down this way, but it stopped. It didn't go past Decatur Junction, so it was called the Nashville Decatur, but it never went to Decatur. So there's the Decatur Junction wide, where trains can turn around, back up, or whatever. And you can get on an aerial and still see where that one was. If you get closer, you see the earthwork. Okay, ready for the next one, thank you. So wherever I go, I try to put maps in that are relevant. So here you are, and y'all probably know all this stuff. Here's Sulphur Creek, and we're a little bit north up there. Looking at the crossings, that's what this is for. There was, of course, the huge trestle at Sulphur Creek, and then Swan Creek, there are 2 crossings. Then you get into Athens, Town Creek, there are a couple, and then Old Schoolhouse down here. And the next one, please. South of Athens, Old Schoolhouse branch, and then the Tunnel Station. Swan Creek again, and then Pryor Creek, and then the last one was at the Y. Trestle. And their bridges and their trestles and their culverts. And down this part of the country, especially this low, it's so flat and swampy, everything's a trestle. You couldn't really span a creek too much with a bridge. So these are all trestles, and then north of Athens, trestles as well, going right up to the Sulphur Creek. All right, next please. Thank you. All right, what was on the railroad? Well, there were trains, and I put these to scale the best I could. You know, I shrunk and did all that. So these are about side by side. That's your wood burning, tender car, wood, water in there. Here's your wood burning locomotive from the Civil War. Here's a big boy now. And this thing weighs about 7 or 8 times as much as that. Those old locomotives will pull maybe 10 or 12 cars and average 12 to 15 miles an hour, which wasn't real fast, but it was a heck of an improvement over wagons. Especially because you don't have to feed the train when it's still. You got to feed mules and horses all the time. All right, and then
I'm anticipating you lose.
okay, I'm just gonna trust it. I guess when I pause, it's that time. So this is a typical locomotive. It's hard to find a picture of these things. Here's your steam locomotive, passenger car, flat car, and the box car. So what else is on the railroad? Bridges and trestles. This is like lots of pictures of bridges, but nothing from when the railroad was originally built. They just didn't take pictures of it. A lot of pictures were taken during the war. So this is a picture of the Franklin Bridge over the Harpers River in 1864. And this is a real pretty looking bridge. This was obviously not built from trees and thrown together by the troops. I'll get into that in a few minutes. This is built prefabricated in Chicago and brought down and set in place when they were in a hurry to do so. And you can see, you look carefully, you see the vertical steel in there. This is one of the early versions where it wasn't just wood, they were bringing some steel in to the structure. And as time went on, like now, they're all steel. So this was an advanced piece right here, and there was a patent for it and all that. And they were used on the Union Pacific Railroad out west, almost exclusively. But there's a typical bridge. And I want to throw something here related to this part of the country. So, you remember I had the picture of Decatur down here and the Tennessee River? Well, this Decatur's down here in the Tennessee River, and early in the war, the Federals burned the bridge. That's the M&C bridge going over to the Y. But they still wanted a way to get across with the wagons and what have you, so that this pontoon bridge was put in. It stayed a very long time. It was taken out maybe November-ish of 1864. But there's the pontoon bridge, and I'll get into a little bit lesson here. When you put this bridge out there, of course the current is going that way. It's going to try to push that thing. That's why it's sitting on this side of the piers. It's cabled off to those piers to hold it in place. There's a real science to these things. It made sense. It's all common sense. And they're trestles. This, you know what this is? I don't have to say anything.
Some in the room might not know. So.
Well, okay, I will. This is the biggest trestle on the railroad, and this is the site of the greatest, largest, most significant land battle during the Civil War in northern Alabama, where Forrest came in and set artillery up on hills surrounding it and fired down into the fort. There were 2 blockhouses. We'll get into that later on. Also, there were blockhouses here at the fort. It wasn't very well situated, and he had his way. He killed a lot of people, took a lot of prisoners, and sent a lot of African Americans to Mobile to work on the fortifications there. It's a really famous place. I'll go ahead and say now that typically the bridges that were wood all been replaced by steel, and the trestles all replaced by fill, by embankment, because it's just smarter, it's going to last longer, and won't rot and all that. So there are no old original bridges or trestles that remain, but when I was in an archives going through a book, I saw a picture of him. Yeah. Picture you, yeah, standing in the tunnel. Yeah. And it made my day. I didn't even know there was a tunnel down here. And as it turns out, that's my favorite few miles along the railroad for a lot of good reasons.
A lot of snakes
Yeah, yeah. In the tunnel?
in the tunnel.
Uh-huh.
Rattlesnakes.
Yeah, this is the time of year you need to go.
Yes. Yeah, we're trying to get down to see Hall next month or so. So this tunnel was 20 feet high, 15 feet wide, just big enough for a train to go through. Didn't make it any bigger than it had to be. It should have taken about a year to complete, but they got to where had finally broken through. They worked both sides of Matthews Ridge. They worked both sides with black powder and all that. And when they got to the middle, they were off by a few feet. I don't know how many feet it was, but it wasn't going to work. So they had to spend probably another 7 months, I figured, blasting out a curve in that thing so a train could go through. Therefore, this is the last piece of the railroad to open up. In the meantime, trains would come down, stop there, wagging around, wagging off. When this finally opened, November 20th, 1860, it was a big day. So that's our tunnel, and it's still there, but it's not real safe. But that's the last monument to the railroad, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, now to the war. In February 1862, Fort Donelson was taken to the west of Nashville. It protected Nashville. Nashville was fortified. The Federals came in, took Nashville, and within the next 2 months, the Federals had control of the railroads in Middle Tennessee. And the railroads, well, the Federals were military men, and they weren't experienced at operating railroads. So they set up the USMRR, Military Railroad Organization, which was run by federal military men, but it had to be, we had to have people knowledgeable there who knew how to operate the railroad. So they hired military men under them, and then below that level were people with experience in the railroads themselves, who knew how to operate a railroad, people in private business. So the Federals figured out pretty quickly that this railroad, all of them were going to be valuable in helping them get a foothold in the South to try to win the war. And so, in essence, the Federals wanted to keep the railroads open. The Confederates wanted it shut down. These railroads all went through Confederate territory. And it's hard to protect all those miles all the time. It's impossible. There's not enough troops. So the Federals wanted to keep it open, the Confederates not. In essence, there were battles, or maybe a separate war, over the railroads themselves. You can say there was a war over the N&D itself. Because what had happened was, after 17 months after the railroad opened in November of 1860, 17 months later, the Federals took that railroad, the Confederate Railroad, and were using it as a weapon against the Confederates. That's one of the big stories here. Obviously, that's what happened, but that's the way I put it. They used the railroad as a weapon against the people who used to own the railroad. That's what it was. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so there were different ways of shutting the railroad down. You could burn the bridges or trestles, and when you did, that obviously caused a delay. You could take up track. That's probably what happened here. I don't know where this happened, whose train that was, but somebody probably took up the rail, the train flipped over, to bring out a construction train, pick it up, put it back on, take it to the shop to work on. But that's kind of a cool picture. You like that picture, Robert? Yeah. That's pretty cool. As long as you're not on the train. Okay, so now to the war. There wasn't a whole lot going on, relatively speaking, between early 62 and early 1864. There were battles here and there. The railroad was open, shut down, and what have you. The real action, the meat of the action for our railroad, the National Decatur, came in really 1864. And there were two things going on concurrently. I'm gonna lay one of them out, and then the other, and I'll show you a timeline, how they mesh. So Sherman, of course, he wanted to take Atlanta and all that. He needed supplies to go from Nashville to Stevenson to Chattanooga. Stored up here in Chattanooga to supply him. So if something got cut up here, road got cut, he'd have plenty of supplies there to feed him, supply him, munitions and what have you, down here in Georgia. So here's the loop. Obviously, the shortest way to get from Nashville to Stevenson is the Nashville and Chattanooga. But in early '64, he had a planning session, and there are a couple of different versions of this, but the one I put in is that they figured they would need 16 trains every day, with 10 cars each train, running down to getting from there to there. For how many months? I don't know how many months they did that, but 3, 4, 5 months, to have enough supplies there to support that army. But this railroad wasn't in the best shape. It's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of heavy cars, and the Nashville and Chattanooga wasn't ready. So, because of that, Sherman used the Nashville and Decatur. It was going to be in better shape before this one was. When this was fixed up, and I'll get there in a minute, he ran trains down from Nashville to Decatur Junction, over to Stevenson, unloaded, and off to Chattanooga. For about 2 months, he used that loop. So a lot of trains are coming down that way, going through that tunnel, which makes that tunnel even more exciting. That was the plan. The Nashville and Chattanooga was finally repaired in June with enough sidings and what have you, so that this railroad, N&D, was only used for a couple of months. So, in the meantime, Nashville and Decatur needed work, but that work occurred before the Nashville and Chattanooga, and that work was done largely by Granville Dodge, who with his troops came in and built 5 bridges and 20 trestles. He inventoried the Nashville and Decatur, and almost everything was out. So he built several bridges and a whole lot of trestles. A lot of his trestles went where there should have been a bridge, because they were in a hurry. And they left those temporary trestles in too long, they get washed out. Then you lose your railroad. So he got it started, and then another name I came across in my research that came out of nowhere was Boomer. I saw a reference to it once, then again and again. And Boomer played a big role. He's the guy that owned the company in Chicago that made those prefabricated, those pretty bridges like Harper's River and Franklin. He came in just a few weeks behind Dodge and tore out anywhere between 22 and 29 trestles and replacing those bridges. Which is a horrible waste, but in war, they wanted their railroad open, so they built something, and then next month, tear it out. It's just money and manpower. They had a war to win. It's pretty amazing. But this is the story I'd never come across before. I'm not sure many people had the role that Boomer played in this. Well, okay, so the railroad was finally, they had the bridges and trestles put in place. So first the N&D was fixed, later the NC. And both these railroads were repaired, but they needed better protection. And there were 3 different basic types of protection the railroads had as the war progressed. Initially there were camps that didn't do well. Can you imagine a camp with forest coming up on it? So camps didn't last very long. It was the stockades, which is like a fort with an open no roof on it. And then the stockades didn't do well, so it was the blockhouses, which was the last form of protection. And the blockhouses were put basically where there wasn't another fort, and at each end of a long trestle bridge, or one end if there's a shorter one. So there's a report in the record, official record says there were 36 blockhouses built along N&D in Nashville and Decatur. And one of the things I did was say, forget the 36. I looked at Topo and all the records, and I drove and I trespassed and looked at the crossing to see where there should have been a bridge, where there should have been a trestle, and built my own table that's in the back of that book. And I don't think anybody's ever done that. I built a table for where the crossings were and what kind of crossing it would be, where's the trestle, and I added them up and I got 37. I said, well, But then, and I think this is right, I realized that I was off by one at the Elk River. I assumed there was one there, it's not. So I think I've gotten to 36. Anyway, that was a big deal for me. I felt a challenge. So, blockhouse. This is not on the Nashville Decatur, but it's pretty typical. The blockhouses were designed by Merrill. We just saw a picture of him briefly, and built by First Michigan. It was run by Colonel Ennis. And Merrill designed this blockhouse, tested some in Smyrna. And the way they're different from a stockade, obviously, is it's got a roof on it. So that Hood, Forrest, whoever couldn't fire down into these things. The blockhouses were about the bridges were generally low, often there was a hill around, not a good thing. And these blockhouses, you can see the trench around it, double thickness down below, the loopholes where you can fire through. These timbers are typically 18 to 20 inches, so it was a job to cut these things from surrounding forest and put them in place, put a roof on it. They often had a well inside to hold water, and a kind of weird way to get in, like an L-shaped entrance, so that the Confederates couldn't fire right at the door. It was really pretty ingenious. And blockhouses did well, unless somebody like Hood came along with an overwhelming force, or Forrest did with the right kind of artillery, and he was determined to take it. But the blockhouses were kind of designed to hold off for a little while word got to another fort. There were a lot of forts along the railroad, and it wouldn't take too darn long to get reinforcements down. So they weren't supposed to hold out. Yes, sir. Sorry.
On the blockhouses predominantly, and I'm talking specifically L&N. Were the blockhouses specifically on the south side of the trellises or on the north side of the trellis? Or do we know?
The trestles or whatever?
The trestles, yeah.
They were on whatever side made sense. The longer trestles, like Sulphur Creek, would have two. And that's based upon the range of their musket,
Okay.
whatever they had. If it was out of range from one to the other end of the trestle, they put another blockhouse at the other end.
Okay.
So I've never seen any pattern that was north or south.
So we don't know along there if they're on the north side or the south side, where they cross Swan Creek or where they cross Town Creek. Up in Athens, we have no idea if they're on the north side or the south side of those creeks.
I don't think my tables get that specific. I just know kind of where they were at the crossing, but I don't know which side. No, that's a great question. It could be a good place to go search, right? I was just in Columbia about a month ago with some history folks there who went to the Duck River, to the north side. They're pretty good maps, I think by Merrill, map of where that blockhouse was, and you got permission to go on to Boy Scout property. It's been bulldozed. We didn't know until we got there. So we standing by the river, and I have a picture of the bridge at the Duck River, and I held it up, and I said, we're standing right there. Of course, the bridge is different, it's higher now, but we were the same distance from that bridge, so we thought we were probably within a couple hundred feet of that blockhouse, but that would have probably put it in this low area where we were that had been bulldozed. You know what happened. We're hoping to find some earthwork, which is about all you would find is some earthwork. And I do know of one blockhouse where the earthwork remains. It's on private property. There's some out there, and they're hard to find because the mountains are, over time, they've gotten warm, and they're not just real sharp or real elevated. It's tough. You see something on the soil, and you wonder if that's part of the blockhouse or it's natural. Okay, so the tunnel, there it is, and to me, the six miles, or more or less, from Richmond to the Elk River is the most fascinating part of this railroad during the Civil War. I say that to Franklin, and I don't apologize. Franklin's a little proud, if you will, of the war, but so much more happened here over a period of time. Franklin's famous for, what, 1 or 2 days, sort of? Nothing except there's so much going on here. You have Andrews Ridge around this way, heavily forested. So Dodge was able to set up some sawmills that they do need your help. We can kind of try to locate that. Some maps in the book that he's drawing, concepts. There were sawmills here on both sides, probably, to cut timber for bridges, blockhouses, cross ties, whatever. That was really a great source there. You had a large trestle here, coming up the side, the north side of the tunnel hill. It was a big wooden trestle. There were a couple of, 2 or 3 forts down here at the Elk River. There was a huge contraband camp. There were several contraband camps in Tennessee. And some of the local folks have done a lot of research on that. They shared with me, which I appreciate. But in January of '64, the Tunnel Hill contraband camp was set up for displaced former slaves and slave people who were coming north to find a place for shelter. And the government took care of them, but they didn't want to take care of them for long. So there were crops here, and they were supposed to work the crop, pay their own way, which they sometimes did, sometimes didn't. There were up to 1,400 people at this contraband camp. I think it was maximum on 2,000 acres. And when, I'll jump to Forrest. When Forrest came up this way, these folks knew he was coming, they took off. A lot of them ended up following the federal troops up to Nashville. So a whole lot going on here. And of course, Dodge had a huge presence. All the damage I've read about or bridges and trestles, I never heard of anybody even trying to damage the tunnel. I expected to see that. That would be a mess to clean up. They must have guarded that tunnel really well. To shut that thing down would be a mess. Didn't see a thing about it. So here's the timeline I put together. You got Dodge coming in building trestles and a few bridges, November through February, and he was done. Boomer comes in starting the next month. He takes a while through May, replacing trestle. He even replaced the one in Franklin that didn't need to be replaced. His contract was to replace all of them, and so he kind of did. Then Ennis was building blockhouses March through June of '64. Sherman's trains were running on the loop for those 2 or 3 months, April through June. The Tunnel Hill camp was open January on, and then all the other activity from December '63. So I just kind of overlaid all these different things that were going on, and I highlighted April and May because you can imagine being at that tunnel area in April or May of '64, all the activity. That was a hotbed of activity. Trains coming down for Sherman, construction trains for Boomer and Dodge, plus regular passenger trains. There were still some passenger cars coming through. Construction trains picking up torn up engines and what have you. It would have been a fascinating place to be. And the scheduling, I don't know how you do that. This couldn't have been very efficient to run Sherman's cars through here with the bridges and trestle being worked on. Railroad was shut down. So that couldn't have been very efficient. It must have been a big hurry to get the NC open because you're working there with construction. I don't know how you could be very efficient. Okay, then battles. The main battles on the N&D were in September through December of '64. And the first one, a lot of folks are familiar with around here, was when Forrest came up through Athens. Actually, he started right about here, came across, and started just below Athens with his troops. They didn't have no horses, so they would steal horses, get people to ride on when they needed. He moved north. It was the Battle of Athens. He moved north, burning bridges and blockhouses, having his way. He got up to the tunnel and burned the houses that these African Americans lived in, that they lived in squalor. They deserve better than that. I don't know what he was thinking, but he burned all that up, moved up towards Pulaski when he didn't have what it took to take Pulaski. So here he is traveling with his stuff. He had a few grass pieces probably. So he took off, went east towards Nashville and Chattanooga, which was really the goal. What he wanted to do was to deter the federal. Sherman, shut that railroad down. It would hurt the federal work down here in Georgia. He got to about Winchester and realized that that railroad was very well protected, better than he could handle. So he left. Went back up north of Columbia, about Spring Hill, did some damage there, and then headed back across Tennessee River. That's what he did. I think I put a slide in here. Yeah, okay, for you guys and ladies, I put a slide in estimating what he did during that couple of weeks in late September of '64. Seemed like he captured about 2,000, killed and wounded 300 or 400, destroyed 4 locomotives, 100 cars, destroyed 19 or 20 blockhouses, 16 bridges and trestles, and 30 miles of track. So he did what he set out to do in terms of damage, but it didn't change the course of the war, to me, at all. And I'll note down here, y'all familiar with the Sultana, the boat on the Mississippi River? That, yeah, well, I followed some of these captured folks down to the prison and over to the Sultana. A lot of them from Indiana and Illinois, and I figure probably 200 or 300 of the 2,000 he captured were on that Sultana and died there, which is another connection to the war here. And I think how pitiful it is that you survive the war, you survive Forrest and Hood, all these battles, you survive disease and prison camp. The war is winding down, you're going home, and you die going home. It's just horrible. They deserve better than that. That's what happened because of greed of people running the boats. They wanted them full of people, and they didn't want to repair the boiler properly. It blew up in the middle of the river, and a lot of folks died.
The Yankees.
Yeah. Maybe Steve did. Sorry?
About 1,500.
Yes. Yeah.
Mr.
Almost
Lincoln.
like the Titanic almost.
Mr. Lincoln's man sold too many tickets on that boat. What happened? He sold a lot of tickets he shouldn't.
He did.
Yeah.
I think it was supposed to hold 250 people.
Right.
And it took 2,000.
Right.
And there were other boats that could have gone out. If somebody
Something like $3 or $4 a head.
Somebody has a side business going. Yes, sir.
A lot of your second and third Tennessee volunteer Union Cavalry gobbled up at Sulphur Creek and on the Forest Raid, wound up at Cahaba Prison in Alabama, shipped to Vicksburg, and they got on the ill-fated ship to the Sultana.
I saw some Tennessee units in there, but I don't have it broken out how many there were. Yeah, the Cahaba was the big one for that.
You
That's
might
right.
have a battalion of the second, and maybe a squadron of the third, battalion, 4 to 6 companies, and then the other 2 to 3 companies. They were gobbled up, of course.
Thank you. I think you need to be up here. Okay.
This is fascinating. Keep rocking.
All right. I'm trying. I haven't had dinner yet, so I'm gonna try to keep rocking. I do better on empty stomach, actually. So that was Forrest. Here comes Hood. He's in North Georgia, tries to come across the river at Decatur. Can't do that. He goes over to Florence, waits for the water to fall, and he crosses with Forrest, and they arrive. Is this thing working? No, wrong one. They arrive about Columbia, south of Columbia, do some sparring there, and then, of course, the Federals take off for Spring Hill and sneak by at night, which is a pretty amazing thing. And then they're heading for Franklin. Their goal, of course, is to get to Nashville where they're safe. They'll fight if they have to. And so, I had a meeting at Carmen famous house in Franklin a couple of days ago, and there were 75 people there, and I asked a question about how the Battle of Franklin occurred. Because I'm pretty sure that, I know when the Federals got to Franklin, there was no way to get across the river. I'll show you a map in a minute. There was no way ready for them. They're supposed to have pontoons brought down from Nashville, but they weren't there. But that main bridge in Franklin had washed out in mid-November. Here come Schofield, Cox and them 2 weeks later. I don't understand how the Federals, some of y'all are going to know the answer probably. I don't know how the Federals didn't have the brains and the foresight to put a bridge up for these Federals coming north. They had 2 weeks. They ended up building one in half a day. They had 2 weeks to do it. But because there were no bridges there and they had to build them, Forrest, Hood, and them decided to attack, and they did. And that's why the battle was at Franklin. It could have been at Columbia, maybe. It could have been north of Franklin. But it's all because of bridges, or lack of bridges, that we had the battle at Franklin. It's just one of those things. Oh, what does that mean?
I think you're on your money.
All right, well, tell me if, it's just history, and I've only researched a certain amount, but it's really pretty fascinating. If anybody has any idea why the Federals didn't build a bridge in Franklin in late November, I'd love to know. That's a really important piece of information.
Have you ever tried to get a Yankee to work?
Well, there you go.
The picture shows the federal government has changed from before then to now, obviously.
Maybe there are holidays in there, so paid holidays.
I agree.
Yeah. Anyway, that's what happened, I bet. So, all right, thank you. Here's Franklin, and I'm not going to wear you out with Franklin, but there's the railroad bridge. And when the Federals got there, it was operating. There was what they call a county bridge right here. That shows pontoons, but there were no pontoons there. Pontoons didn't make it to Franklin. This is sketch. So there was a county bridge, which is real close to the water. That was another way to get across. Between these two was a ford, and then down here, on the north side of town, was a wagon bridge. And that's what got washed out in the middle of November. So the Federals ride up here, and they say, well, I guess the pontoons will be here for us, but they're not. They came later, after they already rebuilt this stuff, sent them back to Nashville. So the Federals hunkered down, they entrenched themselves on the south side of Franklin, while these folks, a lot of troops were building that bridge, repairing the ford, which was in bad shape, and planking over the railroad bridge. In the meantime, they were running their 800 wagon train across the river and had to get that out of there. They couldn't lose all that. 800 wagons, which would have swallowed up Franklin. They had a few hundred residents, so they worked those across there. And just about the time, it sounds dramatic, but it worked out this way. About the time the last wagon went across, more or less is when Hood decided to attack. And you know the battle was largely dark, and it was brutal, and it was not good for the loss of Confederate life. But that's what happened. And at midnight, the word was put out, the order before then, of course, we're going to have a victorious retreat. That's just my term for it. They retreated across, the troops that were down here came across the river and headed for Brookwood and Franklin. And basically, there's Columbia Avenue down here, and basically the troops on the west side of Columbia Avenue came through that little town, across that bridge, and the troops over on this side worked their way basically along the railroad across the planked over bridge with their artillery and what have you. Got on the other side about 3 in the morning. They pulled the planking off that bridge. They burned that and burned that. Couldn't do anything with the ford anyway, to prevent Hood from making a fast chase of them if he chose to do so. So that's the way they left it. They left the railroad operational, but nothing else. It's kind of like they left it the way they found it when they came to Franklin. So Hood followed them along to Nashville, and he used the train, repaired what was the damage down here all the way to Decatur, repair that, and use this as a supply line to help reinforce him for the Battle of Nashville, which the Confederates lost in 2 days. Hood turns around and heads out on his 11.5-day, 100-mile retreat, which is just gruesome to me. So now, forest is gone. I'll do this. I forgot about that slide. Most people haven't seen a wagon train going over a pontoon bridge. I found this. This is not the Tennessee River. This is not Hood coming across. But it's kind of a typical pontoon bridge with a surface there to run on, and cables on one side holding it, and there's a wagon train along it. I love the pictures. They just bring it all to life. And there's a pontoon. There were different kinds. That's a wooden one, and they were heavy. But a pontoon like that could support about 2,000 pounds, maybe 2,500 pounds, maybe like a car. It would hold a lot. So you space those things 10 or 15 feet apart, and you could have some pretty good weights going across it. But the troops, they couldn't march, because that would be a force that the pontoons weren't designed for, that kind of rhythm. And they couldn't just put too many wagon trains on it. They had to be kind of careful not to make these things sink and fill with water. But there were wagon trains that carried the pontoons just like there are wagon trains that carry supplies. There were multiple wagons, mules and horses that carried those things where the troops thought they needed to go across the Duck River or Rutherford Creek or what have you.
Were those pontoon bridges before and after the war used? I always thought that was a wartime thing by the military, but that was also civilian used?
I haven't seen that.
Okay.
I think you're
So
right.
it was more of a military, let's say over the water, and that's all.
Yes. The one in Franklin, they had one in Franklin for the entire time that the Federals had control of it. They chose to have that instead of, or in addition to the bridge. So they were basically wartime. Because you could pick them up and move them. Sometimes they leave them in place. But they weren't ready for Federals in Franklin. So the war is winding down, and what happened to the railroad? What did it look like after the war? I chose some of the crossings to highlight. The Harpeth, which is a major bridge in Franklin, the Elk River, they were destroyed by Confederates or Reagan. It's hard to tell exactly which one is which. About half of these 8 or 9 times, maybe 4 or 5 times, the Elk and the Harpeth were destroyed by the Confederates. And another 4 or 5 times, rain washed it out. So that's a lot of replacing bridges. The Duck was even more so, 11 or 12 times. Sulphur Creek, I counted 3 times, all because of Confederate burning. The track, it's 122 miles of track from Nashville to Decatur Junction. I counted up in bits and pieces, and some track was, replaced twice, there's once up here, some of them was none. I figured overall, about 60 miles of track had to be replaced during the war. And the blockhouses, the full blockhouses of the 36, and they were only in place in like April of '64 to December. They had 9 months. And of the 36, I counted 45 rebuilds. So a lot of blockhouses had to be replaced twice, maybe 3, some of them 3 times. It took a beating. The Federals did their own damage. They weren't good to the railroad. When you're in war, you don't build stuff back like the original railroad was. The Nashville Decatur was really well built. It's one of the few southern railroads that had ballast. Most of them, I think most, had the cross ties sitting right on dirt. So they wouldn't last that long. But the N&D, the guys who funded that, thought, we're going to spend more money up front and save on maintenance down the road. No, they had really good quality cross ties on ballast, good rails. It was in good shape, better than most Confederate railroads. But in the railroad wars here, a lot of the track is gone, as you can imagine. Most of the bridges and trestles weren't the quality that they had before. They might be functional, but they weren't going to hold up for many years because it was military. Most of the depots, or all, were gone. The 12-mile line from Columbia to Mount Pleasant hadn't been rebuilt yet. They stole the rail off that to use elsewhere, the Federals did, and then put that back. And most of the locomotives and cars were lost or destroyed. So General Thomas was still hanging around Nashville. He was in charge of turning these railroads back over to the owners. There were still 3 owners. It wasn't the N&D yet. There were still 3 companies. And he transferred them over in September 65 after 3.5 years. And the companies had to get going again. So they borrowed a lot of money. They bought a lot of locomotives and equipment from the federal government at auction. And then later on, they were able to buy about half price if they needed to. You went along, the price went down, you know, at sale. The government had a sale. So the railroads were able to rebuild themselves. And they were again operating. And it's amazing to me, I found some financial numbers for each month, starting September 65, of the next 12 months. Every month of those 12, the railroads overall made a profit, which is pretty remarkable to me, given that the economy was stinky, the crops were in bad shape, and inexpensive form of labor was gone. But they managed to make money and pay their debts back. Their timetable for repayment was extended because there was a lot of damage, and the federal government knew they were going to be good for it, felt they were going to be good for it, and they were. But then, come about 2 years later, early '67, the 3 railroad companies realized that they could operate this railroad better, better as one company. Less management, what have you. So in '67, they combined forces and started operating as the N&D, but they weren't really called that until January 1868. And then come L&N, Seaboard, CSX, and all that. And I don't get much into what's current. I'm focused on the war. But if I'm going to summarize this, it'll be what you've already heard. Can you go back one, please? Sorry, I messed with you. Yeah. To me, the big story is that the Federals stole these 3 railroads and used them as weapons against the Confederates. Had them for 3.5 years and turned them in pretty bad shape. And the main thing this railroad did was that 2 or 3 months in 1864 when it supplied a lot to Sherman. So that's the most famous thing this railroad did. And then we have the tunnel that I love, that remains as a monument. So I started out by talking about the depot, and this whole story of mine may end up with the depot because I'm pulling a team together in Franklin to look at the feasibility of buying that acre lot, making an offer to the owners, figuring out what that development would look like, where we would have the depot, hopefully where it used to be, maybe put a caboose in there and have something cool to do in Franklin. So it starts the depot and it may end the depot, hopefully before I die. So that's all I got. Unless you want to see, yeah, that's it. I got some more slides. If somebody has a question, I might be able to jump to another slide, show some things, but I'm open to questions or embarrassment or whatever.
One thing the Yankees did was put together railroad rebuild companies, as I understand it, so that when Confederate raiders would come along, wipe out sections, here come this training bunch of soldiers to put the railroad back together. Do you have any more information on that, or do you know what I'm?
I didn't see much of that. There was a group out of Murfreesboro, just like the First Michigan Engineers Mechanics. It was a competing group of soldiers who were really good. They were older than typical soldiers. They were really good at working with wood, working with their hands, with shovels, also trained in the military. And they were probably, those 2 groups were probably what you're talking about. They would run around and make repairs. They were trained for that, but they could fight as well. But yeah, you put it in a different way than I'm used to thinking about it. But yeah, there were people who had expertise at that that were needed in a hurry. Yes, sir.
So the tunnel is still there. I assume that's on private property?
It is.
All private property. I've been there.
Is that 5 or 6 or 7 years ago when we had a trip up That's what he-
Well, it was when Buzz died that, had the stroke that afternoon.
Yeah.
Remember, that was his last trip.
Oh, who was
I
that?
had some pictures.
All mine.
Like 20
Yeah, right. Somebody,
The
somebody,
old
who-
business
like Chris
that
too.
come out of that stroke. He was one of our older members.
I think I was there that trip. What was his name?
Who, Buzz Estes?
Yes,
Richard?
yes, he was, I met him here. He was kind enough to come talk to me when I came to Athens.
Yeah, he had a stroke that afternoon after we got back from.
Uh,
Garth, were you up there that day?
I was there, but I don't remember him having a stroke that day.
Well, it was that afternoon after he got home, we got word that he had had something had happened, and come to find out he had had a stroke.
I'm sorry, he was good to me.
Yeah.
Going back for a second, the north and south ends of the tunnel, that property is owned by two different people. I haven't had luck hearing from the people who own the north end, but Hall has been really gracious.
He lived real close to it.
Yeah, my house, I've got basically 2 rooms and a dog spot hallway that was constructed, somewhere between 1830 and 1848. And the, wall in perfect plastic. But, it was commandeered by the Yankees that land before that is about 2 fields away from my house.
This was near the tunnel.
Well, it's actually.
He's right in Prospect.
2 miles
As it is
south
now.
of the
Okay.
tunnel
Could
in
have moved.
the west side of Prospect.
He was right on the Elk River.
My property, borders on the east side of the road, there at, the west side of, the town built on a hill.
Yeah.
When you come down the hill, and my property starts near the old storefronts.
Jack, do you actually own part of the old railroad there?
No, no.
I thought you did, when you
No,
did
I
deal.
bought a strip of land that, to it. 700 by 50 foot.
Yeah, I thought it was on the railroad bed.
No, unfortunately not.
Tennessee, that's landowners reclaiming the track.
Yeah.
There's some more questions. Let's get to the, I think Mr. Newman has a question back there.
Yes, sir.
Is that N&D Railroad bed predecessor to later railroad, same bed, Nashville Southern, LEN? I had family, great uncles that were section managers of some of that railroad south of Spring Hill. Is it the same railroad bed?
Yeah. I studied maps, and I couldn't find anything anywhere that the railroad had moved except just north of Decatur, where a pretty good section was shifted 2,000 feet west to straighten all that up. That's the only thing I found. But in a recent meeting, some guy said, "Oh, Walter, at the West Harpeth, they moved the track around the river," and I'll have to check that one out. So 99% of it is right where it was in plan view, but elevation is different, of course.
And on occasion, there's go ahead, Robert.
You've been so patient, Robert. Yeah.
So what did they use to start the fires and going down the flames on the circuit?
Y'all probably know that better than I do. There were some, did they use torpedoes? The Confederate torpedoes at Sulphur Ridge? Probably not. That's a federal thing, wasn't it? Okay. Okay. So they probably had some kind of oil and combustible material. I don't know how they did it exactly, but they were good at it, and they had to do a lot of that under fire from the enemy. Especially in Franklin, when they were burning those bridges, there were federal soldiers on the north side firing at them while the engineers were doing that. Who can give a better answer than I did about how the trestles were burned?
There'd be a lot of cars, because that was a common product produced locally. The invaders could get it, smear it over, and once you get a fire going on an all-wood structure, that's all you wrote, especially if it's at the forest.
hear that, Robert? Tara?
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, one other thing, I was thinking that they could have used hay and they surrounded it and then they probably lit it up because hay would become flammable.
Maybe. You think they needed hay? Probably not.
You could use, well, like Sulphur Creek, for instance, you had 2 blockhouses, you had 3 different cavalry units there, so forage was available. So once forage had invested the place and all the Yankees had their heads down, you could use every kind of combustible there was. That thing went up like a rolling pin.
It would be something to see, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't it, so,
It would have. Thank you for the question. Wait a minute. Okay.
I have a question.
You have to answer.
On cavalry stuff, but you're the railroad man.
Right.
Compatibility of gauges. Smithers and Charleston, for instance, was on a particular gauge. Was the railroad you're speaking of tonight on the same gauge, or was that a problem here in this configuration of all the railroads needing different gauges? So some trains could run on some tracks and sitting on others. What's your findings on that?
Yeah. It laid out the book pretty well, but you don't need the book to hear this. The North had a lot more lines than the track, and they were much more unified in terms of gauge. In the South, the railroad companies seemed to be kind of independent. They didn't want to do what the government said. They were stubborn and independent-minded, and there were at least 3 probably different gauges, the distance from the inside of one rail to the inside of the other rail. And this railroad was 5 feet. It was 60 inches. In the 1880s, the whole country went overnight, went to 56 and a half inches, 56 and a half inches overnight. That was a standard. But during the war, the Confederate railroads were a mess. And that really hurt, obviously, mobility. Going from here to there, you had these change trains or change axles. Some of the axles in the North, anyway, were adjustable. You could pick the thing up and run it in a few inches and put it back on. I'm not sure the South had that. It was a disadvantage, and largely because companies wanted to stay independent. They don't want to be told what to do. From what I read.
Wasn't one of the gauges, not in post-war, the alleged distance between the wheels of a rolling chariot?
That's what they say.
Randomly?
Yeah, that may be the 4 feet, 8.5 inches. That could be it. I question that, but you hear it a lot.
Well, the gauging on what you referred to as the loop had to be compatible, so it must have all been the 5 foot.
That's a great question. I don't know what they did with that, but it makes sense. It makes sense to be 5 feet because
well, I guess
they
could have altered it by moving the tracks in and out. So.
Right.
But it had to be compatible.
You're right. That would have been the quick thing to do. Make it all 5 feet, and it all changed later on. I hadn't thought about that.
You know, some of that track's still being used from Columbia through Cullioca, Campbell Station, Linville to Pulaski. Tennessee Southern runs on. Because I know I was trying to get to an old cemetery, the Shane Cemetery at Campbell Station, had to wait for the train to come through.
It wasn't in a hurry, was it?
It wasn't in a hurry.
Yeah. The track's in bad shape.
Anybody else? Alan?
On the prefab bridge coming out of Chicago, how many sections or whatever it was? You're talking about how they put them up.
Right. I wrote a section on building a bridge in one of the appendices, but I never was able to see how large the piece of ore that came in. Even one, okay, let's take the Harpeth River. One side of that would have been really heavy. And the forces that built it had to get out in the river and set up hoists to put that thing up in place on top of the abutments and the stone. It was just the right elevation. I don't know how much weight they could handle, but you're working in the river and doing that. I don't know the answer to that. But something like the Duck River, obviously, that would have had to be in sections, maybe obviously from pillar to pillar.
Anybody else? That's calm. All right, thank you, Walt.